Welcome to the LPP podcast. LPP, as most viewers and listeners will know at this point, stands for the Life Process Program, an online coaching and counseling program for those who want to get beyond their addictions and improve their lives. This program was created by Dr. Stanton Peele with input and approval from many of his great colleagues, including the late Aaron Beck, who developed cognitive behavioral therapy in the 1960s. Today you are watching or listening to a discussion between Archie Brodsky and Stanton Peele. Archie Brodsky has stepped into my role as interviewer. Archie interviews Stanton about, his life's work, as told in Stanton's memoir, A Scientific Life on the Edge. Brodsky is a research associate in the Department of Psychiatry, Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, Harvard Medical School, where he is the co-founder of the program in psychiatry and the law. He's also a member and former chair of the Human Rights Committee at Massachusetts Mental Health Center. Among these accomplishments, he's also the co-author of 15 trade or educational books in the mental health field, one of them being the 1975 book, Love and Addiction, which he wrote with Dr. Stanton Peele. Love and addiction changed how we think about addiction. Archie and Stanton met originally as teenagers at the University of Pennsylvania's General Honors Program. Since then, Archie has participated in every stage of Stanton's revolutionary career, as well as his personal life. His interviewing Stanton today about his memoir, A Scientific Life on the Edge, My Lonely Quest to Change How We See Addiction, is thus not only unique in the addiction field, but for the entire memoir genre. Now, enough preamble from me. Please enjoy this discussion between Archie Brodsky and Stanton Peele.
Well, Stanton, we're going to be talking today about your memoir, A Scientific Life on the Edge, My Lonely Quest to Change How We See Addiction, which was published last year. And we're going to talk about your life and work as you've summed it up there. And I'll start by introducing an overall theme that we can, think about as we go through the more specific areas. I see you as a larger than life person who hasn't been recognized as such, who hasn't really been given or a world large enough to operate in, one that would give full range and scope to your talents and recognize and take seriously your contribution to the full extent that it deserves. It seems that you've always struggled to create a larger arena for yourself and expand the scope of your activity and work. So I think we'll be talking about that as we go through some of what you've written about in this fascinating book. Starting with your early life, can you say something about what forces created you and how you created yourself? You're a social psychologist who studies how a person's psychological dynamics interact with the social environment. Can you apply that to yourself? How did you learn early on from your social environment in its various parts to act effectively on that environment?
Well, a standard memoir in the addiction field, including by people like Mark Lewis and Maya Salovitz, who are largely critics of the contemporary addiction model, begins with their being addicted and institutionalized or having near-death experiences. That I didn't come into addiction in that way. I came into addiction, I think, through three avenues. One was to have been hyper conscious about my environment and the interactions of the people in it from quite an early age. Secondly, I became aware that my father's methods of coping, God bless Ted, were not optimal. He was a knowledgeable man, but he overreacted to instantaneous stimuli and negative challenges. And that led him to veer off in directions that were clearly dysfunctional. I describe in the book how when I was about 13 or 14, I read an article in the Philadelphia Bulletin about a man who had been in rehab who came home to his apartment and his wife had moved and there were boxes all over the place. He took one look at that, spun around and went out on a bender. And I saw my father do many similar things over his life. And so I instantly perceived addiction as being part of a larger sphere, not just one connected to drugs and alcohol. And the third avenue that was really critical to me, as you pointed out, was my training. I'm a social psychologist. When we were studying, when I was getting my PhD, addiction was nowhere to be found in the curriculum. It was up to me to apply that kind of information, how people's interactions with groups affected their behavior, a developmental aspect, how people changed over time. All of these are standard psychological principles that were taught to the nth degree at the Department of Social Psychology at the University of Michigan, a department that disappeared with my graduation, by the way. They no longer have an integrated social and psychological program. And so I always looked at addiction from the standpoint of psychological dynamics, from the standpoint of the individual as a part of his or her developmental path, and as a way of the individual interacting with other groups. And so compared to virtually everybody in the addiction field, I wasn't led to addiction by addiction, drugs or alcohol in my own life, for starters, or necessarily from addiction by around them and the people that were most immediately associated with. I came as an outsider from the addiction field, but I think as an insider from the experiential field.
In the book, you tell some really interesting stories going back a little farther about, how you, even from childhood, you saw life as a series of challenges that in school, just getting through school and in your neighborhood, that, you were always confronted with problems in dealing with people. And to some extent, when you mentioned being an outsider in the field, you were a bit of an outsider in school, for example, because you didn't do things in the conventional way that everybody else did in trying to be successful and to gain favor, but you were more independent. And so as a result, you had to be more resourceful in getting the same, in getting good results going through.
In my life in school was different virtually from kindergarten on. I was encouraged to a degree, some might say too much of a degree, by my mother to follow my own insights into things. And so when I was in school, I was constantly confronting standard wisdom, standard operations. And basically, I just sought to do things the way that I saw worked out the best for me and made the most sense to me. And so my challenge in life, from elementary school through high school, through college, through graduate school, was to translate my vision into the currency of the organization that I was working with. And yet I did get my PhD and I eventually got a law degree where these same issues reappeared. And so it's always been a balancing act, a conflict where I'd run into walls, but where I had the nurturance of I was able to appeal to very strong people. I refer to Dan Katz, the senior member of the Katz Newcomb Lectures, I had an unusually close relationship with as my faculty mentor. I had similar relationships in college with somebody you knew, Henry Tooney, and in high school with an English teacher of mine. And I was always able to get sufficient support to be able to proceed with my own agenda, and even to get kind of good recognition. I won a big fellowship to graduate school. And that's the path I've had in life, to determine my own point of view, to proceed within the standard organizations, and to succeed up to a point. And there's where things came a header in my midlife. Conflicting with AA and the 12-step model kind of threw me off the docket in the addiction field. And my point of view is still, as I relate through the book, distinctive, even when compared with other people. I've mentioned Mark Lewis and Maya Salovitz, Sally Satel and Nick Heather, all the leading figures in the contrarian point of view on addiction, that is the non-disease point of view. I still stand apart. So I have no natural constituency. There's no group of people whose point of view completely aligns with mine. There's no resting place for me. So I'm still clashing at windmills, still at the age of 76, asserting a point of view which I think holds more water and is more effective than that of other people's, that any other theory that I see, and yet which is still not readily assimilated by those in charge.
Yes, and I think what a source of your work and the penetration and creativity of your work in psychology and in the addiction field is your interest in people and their behavior, which I think is really what stands out for me, in all the years that I've known you. Your interest in what people do and why they do it. That seems to me the core of your being. And in both your professional and personal lives, the boundary between which is quite fluid anyway, you have an inexhaustible interest in the flow of life that passes before you, whether it's in the news or in sports arenas or in movies and television programs or in academic disputes or among people you observe and interact with in restaurants or on the street or on buses and trains. And as you acknowledged in your memoir, you wrote, "I question people for as long as they'll let me." As your friend and colleague Stan Morse told you, other people, when they're together, just want to spend time with each other, talking about familiar things, just getting along. You want something valuable to happen. How would you say that abiding interest in people arose? How is it a source of enjoyment for you, and how does it form and energize your work?
Well, the first thing I'd say is to reiterate what you're talking about. I'm a man of infinite interests. Everything I watch is material for my understanding of society and interactions among people and theories of addiction and psychology. I marvel at the degree of unconsciousness. There's a leading figure in the alcohol epidemiology field who denies cultural differences in alcoholism until those were actually scientifically proven empirically. We'll talk more about that later. But when you go to Norway, when you go to Oslo, you see public intoxication everywhere. There are a lot of inebriates on the street. Even ordinary people go into the parks and get drunk on weekends. Whereas a friend of mine who started the International Harm Reduction Association told me that when he moved from Liverpool to Rome, the first thing he noticed was that you never see a drunk person in Rome. So some of the most obvious differences in cultural behavior are ignored. They're regularly ignored. People don't ask the most basic question, why is that? And what is the impact? Likewise, when I'm sitting in an interaction with people, I'm just consumed by the dynamics of people's behavior and also their backgrounds. And as you mentioned, I'll question them for as long as they're willing to give me answers about where they're coming from. And so people are often stunned by how much I know about them when I meet them later, second or third time, because they didn't give it that much attention when they were telling me these things. And they certainly didn't imagine that I would retain and comprehend them. And the reason I retain them is because I form a portrait of the person in the past, in the here and now, and in the future. And I make like predictions of likely outcomes in their lives. They don't always come true, but often I'm online with where they're headed. I just came back, as you know, from a trip to Idaho. I studied in 1968. I studied Japanese with a man named Larry Williamson. He lives in Western Idaho or Northwestern Idaho. And so I get to visit him and a group of his cohorts, his friends and his community every few years. And I've been doing it for 20 or more years. And so I get to see life stories unfold in front of me, where they've come from and what they were like when I knew them and what kinds of outcomes they experienced. My mother and other people I've known in intimate relationships reward me for that kind of analytic perspicacity. I describe one woman in a book who said, you know, I just marvel at you in a room, sitting there watching, taking everything in, thinking about it and thinking where it'll go. It's a supreme quality of mine, for better or worse. Many people hate it. But it was something that was rewarded for me as a child and rewarded for me as an adult.
Yes. So as you were saying earlier, addiction might seem to be a specialized interest and just kind of having only to do with drugs and alcohol and other sort of obvious things like eating addictions or gambling. And yet, as you explained, as a social psychologist and as a person supremely interested in people, you see it in broader terms as a window into what people are, how they're constituted, and what they do. So the way you got into the addiction field, it began with love and addiction. So first, how did you and I come to write that book?
Well, there's two essential. So I see it, drug use, and when I say I see it, drug use is, as Carl Hart is now going around trying to get across, a standard human behavior. It's a way, it's one among a range of behaviors. He doesn't have an actual formulated theory that that's the case. He doesn't have a formulated theory of addiction. He mainly takes pot shots at the ideas that people who consume drugs are overwhelmed by, especially, of course, opioids, especially heroin. But from the start, I saw that that wasn't true. I knew it couldn't be true. I knew that people didn't operate that way. Well, they were magically transformed by a potion. And I personally had experimented with heroin just for the kicks of it, just to make clear that I understood what that was like. Because the image that people had, and to a large degree still have, is you take heroin and you're magically consumed and transformed into another person, which has been so, it couldn't be more broadly disabused, that notion, than the opioid crisis. In 2015, 100 million Americans took an opioid painkiller, and about 1% of them encountered some kind of difficulty. You can't go into a room of people, which is something I often do, and ask, has anybody here ever taken an opioid painkiller? Everybody has. And then when you ask them, did you become addicted? They'll say, no. And if you try and draw them out and say, well, was it appealing to you? Now, these are largely middle-class audiences. They'll say, yes. And if you ask them, well, why didn't you? They'll say, well, you know, it would have disrupted my life too much. I wouldn't have been able to continue with my work and my family. These are things that other people, Norman Zinberg in particular, pointed out early on. So on the one side, I understood that drugs, as Carl Hart is now emphasizing, are just part of the normal panoply of human experience. It so happens that just this week, I got to see a webinar with Bruce Alexander and an interview with Kasia Malinowska and Carl Hart, and they don't talk in the same parlance. But what Bruce says is, he describes the adaptive vision of addiction, which means that people are using drugs for some purpose that they need to alleviate. And Carl Hart doesn't have a theory. He just says, well, look, most people who take drugs are fine, up to 80 or 90% of them, including me, and I take heroin. And so they're both converging on the idea that drugs are a part of the normal range of human experience. On the flip side of that, you and I had an experience that I describe in the book, which was rather remarkable. I knew a woman in my apartment complex. Her father was well known in the field of anesthesia. And somehow at the age of, how old would I have been about then? 22? I always get confused between 22 and 24. I got her father to introduce me to the head of the Department of Pharmacology. And where I was going was the University of Michigan had the most prominent, under Charles Schuster, animal experimentation laboratory with drugs. And I went and spoke to the department chair of pharmacology, God bless his heart. A 20-something kid in dungarees with patches came in and said, well, I'd like to explore your addiction lab. I'm not a drug researcher or animal researcher, but I'm very interested in addiction. He said, okay. And I went in there and I met a man named James Wood, who was administering, and you were with me, the lab, and we had a discussion about addiction. And every point I made, he sort of nodded sagely and said, well, you could say that. For example, he said, well, addictive drugs produce, everybody says the same line, tolerance and withdrawal. And I say, well, don't experienced marijuana smokers become more adept at driving automobiles under the influence? Wouldn't that be called tolerance? And he said, well, yeah, that's tolerance, really. And I say, a withdrawal experience, a complete disorientation following an intense involvement, doesn't that take place in many areas of life? And of course, we were thinking about love addiction. And so we went to the labs and we were, the constant refrain that people had, and I said, described addiction as an experiential phenomenon that humans become wedded to. They said, what about animal addiction? And when we went into the lab, we saw monkeys harnessed to an implanted catheter in an extremely small cage. And they would push a lever a certain amount of times and a drug would be ingested. And our instant reaction was, this isn't a model of human addiction. It's not even a model of monkey addiction. I mean, if you had a monkey in the normal environment, would he be or she be interested in this experience? And later, not long after that, Bruce Alexander started his rat park experiments, which showed that animals who became habituated to opioid morphine solution in a confined cage when they were placed in rat park, a group experience of 8 rats of both sexes with the Ferris wheel and all kinds of rat accoutrements, they eschewed the morphine in favor of the water. In fact, the morphine made it less possible for them to get the greater gratification of interaction with other rats and sexual interactions in particular. So coming at it from that direction, I saw that drugs were not the be all and end all. By the way, I mentioned Bruce Alexander and Carl Hart, a kind of a funny guy named Adi Jaffe, who's a harm reductionist, but he's very biologically oriented, said, Stanton Peele, Carl Hart, and Bruce Alexander are radical environmentalists. And the joke I always make is he doesn't mean that we blow up power plants, but we believe that you can explain addictive behavior solely in terms of the individual in his or her environment. Then switch to the other side, as you're well aware, we had a roommate who we discussed. We live with him. He's deceased. He had a girlfriend who was a high school senior. They sealed themselves off from the rest of the world. They formed an extremely close-knit, all-involving love relationship, not unlike those you saw certainly in college, but even that you see in other areas of life. And then after they went to graduate school together, she was an undergraduate. They were at Berkeley, which was a very kind of with it environment. she quickly became disillusioned with the sedentary life and intellectualized life that he led. She was a smart woman, but more an ordinary person. And one day she left him a tape recording saying she was leaving him. And you and I was in Michigan at the time, and you were in New York. I said, well, that's an addiction. When somebody's all consumed in an involvement that they need for everything, and yet it turns out to have been built on paper mache or a foundation of sand. And then those two ideas were so clearly merged, as they've later been recognized. If you go to Wikipedia, they identify me as the founder of the idea of process addiction, by which they mean things that aren't drugs, gambling, eating, sex, love, other kinds of things that have now been categorized as addiction, gaming. And what I always answer is, I never use the term process addiction. There's addiction. People become enmeshed in an over-entangling involvement that has a negative depreciating effect on their life, and as a result, they cling to it even more closely.
So you would say then that what you and I were trying to do in Love and Addiction, which was first published in 1975, was really to reconceive what addiction is, and that really was not understood at all at the time. And there's been some evolution in the understanding of it since then.
It's like the world is playing catch up with me. They say, wow, Stanton Peele recognized that things could be addictive other than drugs and alcohol. But the underlying way I have of thinking, of people becoming enmeshed in an overwhelming negative experience, and what the dynamics of that experience look like, and what the implications of that model still can't be fully grasped and used.
Yes. So you've gone on from there to write and speak and work in this field in various ways. What are some of the other highlights, like some of the books or other productions or events that you think have really represented important breakthroughs or have really had some impact?
Well, I wrote with you Love and Addiction in 75. It was a full 10 years later. Well, I wrote How Much Is Too Much. It was a more slighting piece in 81. But in 1985, I wrote a book, The Meaning of Addiction, which deals with individual and cultural forces and interpretations and thinking that impact and in fact create addiction. And that book got quite a bit of attention. When I went and visited Alan Marlatt in his office, The Meaning of Addiction was prominently displayed in a small bookcase next to him. And a number of people have pointed out that book as creating a new understanding of addiction. In many ways, it just translated the ideas from Love and Addiction a full 10 years earlier into a more academically based approach. And that marked Love and Addiction was marketed as a mass market paperback. It was a mini bestseller, and it was a relationship book. And I've never lived that down to some extent. The idea, well, Stanton Peele is a popular commentator about love and relationships. But in fact, The Meaning of Addiction was a substantial academic tome that really made a penetration into the academic world. That was followed in 1989 by Diseasing of America, which talked about, at the societal level, about how we conceive the things in broader, more and more often as diseases, and particularly as addictions. I marked the ongoing march around us of the expansion of the addiction concept, but which was in good part that was attributable to me, but that it was applied in often the same diseasey kind of 12-step ways. And then finally, in 1991, I wrote The Truth About Addiction and Recovery, which laid out, based on all of these things, and behavioral, there is a large body of psychologists who've worked with addiction. Alan Marlatt and Bill Miller are two of the prominent ones, whose basic view of what was going on was my own. and Nick Heather and Jim Morford, and who saw that cognition and relationships to the world impacted outcomes in drug and alcohol treatment. And I translated their insights and a lot of cognitive behavioral insights into a book that laid out a model for working with addicted people. And that, as you know, brought me eventually into touch with a rehab facility and to my current online program, which is called lifeprocessprogram.com. And all of these books had a pretty big impact, although specialized within the addiction field. And part of what I'm still trying to do, although I have fresh insights and fresh ways of explaining things, is translating that impact of those 4 books in the last century into a meaningful currency for dealing with today's world.
Yes, and I co-authored The Truth About Addiction and Recovery with you, along with Mary Arnold, who you were married to at the time. And one application in more recent years that you've gotten into is child rearing, although that is taken up in earlier books, including Love and Addiction and The Truth About Addiction and Recovery. But you also wrote about that later in Addiction Proof Your Child and with Zach, Outgrowing Addiction.
Which I wrote with Zach Rhodes, who's a co-host of this program. If you have an understanding of addiction, like mine, you instantly are aware that people are dealing with the world experientially, which Bruce Alexander understands. Carl Hart doesn't express things in that way. He just talks about the epidemiology of, well, people take drugs, and if they have a normal life balance, it doesn't become overwhelming. But that naturally leads to insights and discussion of how people came to that point in their lives to have the kind of experience where they seek, where they're frightened. The word fear is very important in my early work, and pain. I wrote a pamphlet called The Addiction Experience, where I talked about the use of narcotics as a painkiller is not accidental. People are having negative experiences that they use drugs and other forms of addiction to remedy. And it irresistibly draws you into the realm of childhood experience and how children get to be that way in particular families, but in our society at large. I mean, I just have to tell this story. It's overwhelming. I just came back from Idaho, and I was at a small party, and there's a woman, she's part of a family that I know. And she told a story where it's almost like they're going to go back and arrest her now for child abuse. Her son is an adult with his own children. She put him on an airplane to see her spouse's ex-spouse. And he was 4 years old. And she described just this week at this party saying to him, now don't get off the plane. That's the only way you can go wrong is if you get off the plane. And even people who in Idaho are used to people having a lot of experiences are overwhelmed by that. They say, well, that's just impossible. So leaving that story, and this woman told the story with Alon, I said, you could do my addiction theories. How people learn to cope with experience, their outlook on life is a natural derivative of that. At one point, the Drug Policy Alliance created a subgroup under a man, I'll leave his name unsaid, to explore that whole range of experiences. And within a year or so, it dissolved for a variety of reasons. But it's because DPA, and God bless his soul, Ethan Nadelman, they just are uncomfortable thinking in the direction of how does child rearing impact the individual and their orientation towards life in a way that makes it more or less likely that they'll be addicted.
Now, you've done all of this without ever having an institutional position, like a university faculty position or funding. Why did it happen that way? And then, given that you didn't have this kind of support, which is often taken for granted for this kind of work, how did you do it? And what limitations or constraints or boundaries has it imposed on your work?
Well, sometimes when I give a workshop and I express critical thoughts about other professionals, people are appalled, and I say, stop right there. You might find my blunt approach offsetting, even my biggest supporters like Nick Heather do. But how does that sin compare with the sin of a enlarging group of people dying from drug use? Nobody in the world thinks that we've headed in a positive direction or are improving the situation. How does my brusque, confrontational matter compare with that? And then sometimes I say, don't you think they should build a statue to me? Somebody who's been able to maintain an approach that has often been a leading edge in the field in harm reduction, environmental clues and cures and treatments for addiction, in looking at addiction in a broader framework, in being aware that people naturally evolve out of addiction. And I've done all this simply on my own. Isn't that unbelievable? And sometimes I think to myself, it's unbelievable. But going back to my growing up in South Philadelphia in Oxford Circle, I am pretty street tough. I approach problems in a problem-solving manner. I generally avoid despairing. I see opportunities for clicking in and making money. And so in my book, A Scientific Life on the Edge, I describe how in the middle period of my life, when people were really so down on what was called controlled drinking, which we would now call harm reduction, due to the Sobel's travesty, that I had to branch out. I got a law degree, and I was entrepreneurial in that area and in a number of other areas. I marketed myself as a consultant to people who had lost their medical licenses because they refused to go to AA or a 12-step program. I became involved even with the Exxon Valdez on a peripheral basis. I didn't testify at the trial, but I said it wasn't Captain Hazelwood's alcoholism that caused that ship to collide. And through a side set of skills, I was able to maintain myself through a middle period of my life until in this century, I've reemerged in a strange way. Sort of everybody who pioneers in the field doffs their cap to me. Mark Lewis, Carl Hart says I was a role model, Maya Salovitz, Johan Hari, begrudgingly. Everybody who comes up, and Nick Heather, who's the head of this whole group in the UK, who's combating the brain disease model of addiction, all of them say, well, you have to look to Stanton Peele. He started all of this, and for decades, he's been continuing to do it. So I've had a reemergence, but in the strangest way, I'm now one fish in the sea. An awful lot of people now say things more or less similar, and certainly emphasize one or another of my points, even as the disease model still pervades the universe, even as that Nora Volkow is by far the most powerful, despite her evident failure in the addiction universe. She's been through 4 administrations, starting with Bush and Obama, and now Biden, and even Trump. Nobody will question her, and yet everybody knows that things haven't worked. And so I'm still tilting at windmills and saying, you're accepting too much of what's on the table, including Nora Volkow, but other assumptions. And the people who are, I think, most like me in thinking, those radical environmentalists, Carl Hart and Bruce Alexander, are simply, even though Carl Hart's a professor at Columbia who tells people publicly he takes heroin, and Bruce Alexander claims that he's ready to take on the world. He's 82 or 4 now. they're still not willing to get in on the battlefield and bloody their hands, really tackling an approach to addiction, which has proved itself a failure many times over.
Yes, looking back at those early parts of your memoir, where you talk about growing up in a neighborhood Northeast Philadelphia, where there were kids from different ethnic groups, and so you had to sometimes confront hostile forces, and how would you survive and exert your will? That prepared you. That was one of the things that prepared you for dealing with the addiction world, which has often been hostile to you.
There's quite a few stories like that. I have a cousin named Alice Levin, who's a prominent endocrinologist in the University of California system. He himself is well over 70 now. We were playing in my grandfather's neighborhood with a group of kids, and I saw that they were getting increasingly hostile. And I said to Alice, I'm going to count to 3, and then you have to start running as fast as you can back to grandpa's. My view of the world is of a place where you're often going to encounter hostility, and if you push things far enough, vicious hostility, but that basically you can always preserve yourself. I'm not afraid of those events, and I have a fundamental faith that I'll be able to deal with them.
So in the prologue to your memoir, you wrote this in explaining your opposition to the disease theory of addiction. My definition instead sees all addiction, whether to drugs or alcohol or something else, as the result of a cycle of seeking need fulfillment while damaging one's ability to function. It can and does occur for, quote, anyone, but much more so for people in deprived, hopeless, social or psychological circumstances who see little relationship between their endeavors and how they can fulfill themselves. Addressing this disconnect in people's lives is how we can humanely and effectively act to stem addiction, even as most people progress in that direction on their own under ordinary life circumstances and often even quite challenging ones. So would you say that that sums up your view of addiction as applied to self-help in some of your books, as well as in your recommendations for how society might evolve for the prevention of addiction?
Let me return again to the distinguished Bruce Alexander's political orientation, and he says that we're not changing our political institutions to sufficiently reinforce human beings and their communities. Johann Hari has pointed out the same thing. Addiction deaths keep multiplying, and they keep coming up with new disease type solutions. And the fundamental answer that Bruce is pointing out to is if human beings are not in a good relationship to themselves, their environments, and the community, we're just going to have more and more addiction. Although he doesn't put it that way. I'm the one who makes that connection and says, what a futile thing to do to face growing inequality, increasing destruction of communities, and then to say, oh gosh, too bad about that. Maybe we can deal with addiction. Here's an idea. Here's a drug that'll deal with addiction. Carl, on the other hand, emphasizes the social misfortunes and inequalities that lead to those kinds of addictive situations. He's not a political scientist or a political force so much. He's just making that kind of a connection. But what I tried to do in the middle ground is to translate that into a therapy program, which was outlined in The Truth About Addiction and Recovery that I wrote with you and Mary Arnold. It's now on, it was a rehab, and it's now online, and it makes claims like addiction is not a failure or a misappropriation of intake. It's a failure of output. The point, and I now see on the subways that Oasis, the alcohol and drug service in New York, says the answer to addiction and drug problems is connection. That's certainly something Johan Hari has emphasized. And so within our program, I have a number of coaches, one of whom is Zach Rose. We work with people on enhancing their connections to people, communities, work, all the elements, physical health of their society that are going to give them a stronger perch in the world. And ADEMHA, the Alcohol and Drug Abuse and Mental Health Administration, actually convened a group of mental health experts, and they created the 4 pillars of recovery. And those are home, purpose, by which they meant education and work, health. In other words, you need an underlying kind of a physical health, and intimacy. And so the 4 pillars are basically this same ones that I'm emphasizing in a kind of a practical, applicable kind of a program.
Yes, and I think that some of the things that you've said here are captured in a passage from your memoir where you wrote, "I naturally view all behavior as human and seek to understand it in human terms. I view people, addiction, and other psychological syndromes and social problems as puzzles to be thought through and solved." So what you're saying there is that addictive behavior is most helpfully understood as of a piece with ordinary life. The choices people make about getting into and out of addictive involvements are of a piece with other choices they make in their lives. And they are made in the context of those other choices and where those other choices leave them, that, what are the outcomes and consequences of those. And I think that's really part of the underpinning of the self-help that we wrote about in The Truth About Addiction and Recovery.
I mean, the worst thing about, let me get back to Carl Hart and Bruce. They're both opposed to what the National Institute on Drug Abuse is doing. The National Institute on Drug Abuse identifies itself as dealing with drugs in a strictly negative way. Same with, bizarrely enough, since virtually all the top leaders in that arena, whom I know, do the same, National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. All of them view it as a detached part of society, whereas more or less all 3 of us view it as an integrated part of ordinary kinds of life. But I take it one step further in terms of designing ameliorative programs and actual therapy, or it's coaching on the internet, that works on those elements. I mean, Carl Hart's not a therapist, and Bruce Alexander doesn't have a specific kind of a therapy program for that. And as you brought up, I point out more than anybody that the data show, they're including data from Robin Room, who's kind of the most part of the most anti-alcohol forces, that the natural evolution overwhelmingly, and even playing catch up, Nora Volk is starting to say many of these same things, is in an ameliorative direction, that people generally progress out of addiction. That's a standard thing that happens. If you go to a table with a lot of people for dinner and you ask them, how many of you used to smoke cigarettes and be addicted to smoking? Sometimes half or 2/3 of the table will raise their hands. And if you ask how they quit, they all quit through the normal, natural life process. And so it's been a bane that we've identified. Everybody's so proud. Oh, we finally recognize addiction as a disease and drug use and alcohol as negative addictive elements. That's been going in exactly the wrong direction with exactly the negative results you might have predicted from doing that. And yet the result, even among many of the most advanced thinkers, is to tend to double down in that arena and say, well, why don't we come up with more different approaches for dealing with the drug experience alone as our improved, and they're always promising a breakthrough. Nora Volko, I also lectured recently. she gave a keynote address to Tom Horvath and the Smart Recovery Group. She said, we're coming up, and she's been promising this for decades. We're coming up with drugs that interfere with the actual impact of alcohol and drugs. She doesn't talk about alcohol really, so that people won't be addicted to them because they won't experience those things that they're seeking. And then she fails to answer the most basic question. If they're seeking those things, in Bruce Alexander's terminology, adaptive responses, then they'll come up with some other kind of an addiction. It's a futile, endless pursuit.
And one of the pioneers in recognizing and tracing this natural evolution out of addiction, which happens in people's lives, other things being equal, was Harold Mulford, who wrote the sociological analysis in his natural processes model of alcoholism and people outgrowing alcoholism.
Well, I pay tribute to a number of people who are really critical to my thinking. If you go to Norman Zinberg, who wrote Drug, Set, and Setting in '84, his Wikipedia entry, it says he's been highly influential in the thinking of modern addiction treatment theorist Stanton Peele. So that greatly amuses me that I've been inserted into Zinberg's life, which is an important insight. Charles Winnick was the first person to identify in the early 60s, I think 62, that most of the people enrolled in heroin addiction rolls in New York City, where the public health really had their handle on that, 2/3 to 3/4 of them ceased to be on those rolls by the time they reached their mid-30s. And Harold Mulford, one problem in the entire field is that alcohol and drugs are dealt with entirely separately. Nora Volka tells a story about her grandfather being an alcoholic. That's the only time I've ever heard her mention alcohol. Zinberg and Winnick are drug people. Mulford was an alcohol person. But in his own approach, he emphasized the natural process of recovery, that most people did that. And he developed, as a sociologist, he developed a treatment model in Iowa where a community resource person helped people hook up with the natural programs in their environment, marriage counseling, lawyers if they needed them, financial advice and assistance, as a way of globally allowing you to enhance people's lives that make it their progress along the anti-alcoholism route. People come in and out of alcoholism all the time. All of those people are famous in a way. Zinberg, Winnick, you've also mentioned Dwight Heath, Harold Mulford. And they probably all have better academic bona fides than I do, but they're all forgotten. I mean, there was a fabulous obituary for Harold Mulford in Addiction, the biggest international journal. Everybody knows their names, and I knew all of them. I think one of the remarkable things about my career is I bridge from the very earliest pioneers in this approach to addiction to all of the current practitioners whose names I've mentioned. And I've known them all personally in one form or another. And in a way, I can complain, well, gosh, I haven't gotten the acknowledgement and still don't that I deserve. They're basically all forgotten figures. People aren't sitting around talking about Zinberg, Mulford, and Winnick nowadays.
Yes. People in the field tend to associate your name with some of these other pioneers that you've mentioned, people that you've been allied with who apply a similar set of views to alcohol or drugs or addiction generally. But you take pains in a few chapters around the end of your memoir to differentiate your views from those of, even some of the people that you've been allied with. What would you say is the essential difference that distinguishes your understanding of addiction and how you would apply it from any other? Is there some extra step you've taken that you believe no one else has?
As I mentioned, my approach to addiction, which to some extent I've mentioned, Bruce Alexander and Carl Hart accept, is that when you understand addiction as one, and Bill Miller and Alan Marlatt, contemporaries of mine, as an ordinary, as one set of behaviors that people can become addicted to, as following the course of all other ordinary behaviors, that has a tremendous set of implications for treatment, as we've discussed, for child rearing, for societal mechanisms. It says that we'll invest that money instead of investing more money in treatment, which is all we do. And often we doing that, we divert the money from education, from housing, and from health. We're just going to be digging a deeper hole for ourselves. And so compared to anybody else, I follow through on what is the underlying assumption. I think of many of these great figures that they don't take to the further degree. I talk about Norman Zinberg, who I had a prickly relationship with over the years, who gave a public lecture that Bruce Alexander organized a conference in Vancouver, where he says, and he's a person who had emphasized in his own writing that there's no such thing as physical versus psychological dependence. He made fun of me by saying, just because I read the newspaper every morning doesn't mean I'm addicted to newspapers. Afterwards, I confronted him. They're afraid to take things to their logical conclusion. And one example of that, all of those people I've mentioned never confront AA. They don't confront AA. Maya Salovitz doubles down on them sometimes and attacks them sometimes because they recognize that that's a mass social movement and they'll get burnt if they try to do that. And in an ironic way, Nick Heather led a group of people that finds it safer to attack the brain theory model of addiction because that doesn't have a baseline constituency like AA does. One last thing, their volume, which is called Assessing the Brain Model, the Disease, the Brain Disease Model of Addiction, BDMA, is that plunk in the middle of it, they include a section about trauma theory led by Gabor Mate. And they don't recognize at all, virtually, that AA and Nora Volkow and the brain disease model are all in the same caboodle. They're all saying people can't control their behavior because they're taken over by a substance. But the trauma theory is expressed by, and he's not the only one, Gabor Mate, is a disease theory. It's an acquired disease theory due to trauma. And he points out valuable things about childhood experience. But that, in his model, changes people's brains in a way that is a permanent part of them. And so chunk in the middle, I mean, I've never heard Nick further discuss trauma. I brought this up to him and he said, well, I'll leave that where it lays. They're actually promoting the most advanced, modern, and dominant version of disease theory, the childhood trauma theory of addiction, and virtually everything else.
So how do you see the current drug policy reform movement as being deeply compromised?
When harm reduction used to mean, well, harm reduction wasn't applied to control drinking, but what the Sobels were doing was harm reduction therapy. They were making sure people had less explosive relapses. And so harm reduction used to mean a non-abstinent working on improving people's lives around their addiction. And Alan Marlatt went on to develop harm reduction psychotherapy. It's remarkable the extent to which harm reduction approaches, policy, and therapy have now been translated into extremely substance-oriented disease-like approaches. Cutting back on painkillers. We've cut back painkillers for 10 straight prescriptions for 10 straight years, and drug deaths have accelerated to 100,000 a year now in this period, and using substitute and blockage kinds of drugs as a remedy for addiction. They have their place. By the way, when Kasia Malinowska interviewed uh, Carl Hart. It was funny. In a lot of ways, it was a clash because Carl has himself pointed out the limitations of the harm reduction approach. He emphasizes that it's entirely negative towards drugs, but I would emphasize the remarkable degree to which supposedly the most advanced thinkers in the field focus strictly on the drug as the source of the addiction problem, and or very often seek the most button pill to cure it. And it's a failure to comprehend. The title of my book is Scientific Life on the Edge, My Lonely Quest to Change How We See Addiction. It's a failure to fully comprehend what I am and what in many ways they're saying about addiction and what lies in the direction of improving it. In particular, it's so Robin Room doesn't call me a radical environmentalist, he calls me a radical constructivist, by which he means Stanton Peele actually believes that how we think about a problem and a substance and addiction impacts the incidence of addiction, as it does with alcohol dramatically from culture to culture. And yet, what I'm saying is we need a revolution in thinking, which Carl Hart and Bruce Alexander are both trying to do, but I'm identifying that as the target of the only way we'll change our approach to drugs and alcohol, our relationship to drugs and alcohol, and to remedy the addictive situation that we're seeing. As long as we see alcohol and drugs as alien, demonic forces, and don't make peace with their presence in our lives and our world, we're not fighting many of these worthies say, oh, the drug war is all wrong, we shouldn't put people in prison. Absolutely. But in not seeing it as a normal experience to be incorporated in everything else we deal with in life, from child rearing to therapy to policy, will never make an impact on the addiction picture.
So, in terms of how, at this point in your life, how you're continuing to get exposure and to make a difference, you've mentioned your online life process program, a coaching program. You also blog on the online magazine Filter. So, how do you see your current activities as, carrying on your work and looking toward your legacy?
Well, I'm not invisible. Bruce Alexander gave the group of people who wrote Assessing the Brain Disease Model of Addiction are part of a group called Addiction Theory Network. I actually got kicked off that list. That's a whole other story. But I'm giving the second in their series of podcasts, webinars after Bruce, because people recognize my role and my position and my brand. I do contribute actively to Filter, which is the most cutting edge ever online magazine dealing with addiction. And I do have this ongoing coaching program where I have a number of coaches called the Life Process Program. So I sometimes sit and puzzle myself where I fit in the field. I'm not widely accepted. And even among some people who are close to me, I'm kept at a hands-off distance. And yet I am fairly omnipresent. And so my memoir, in a way, is understanding both how I got that way, how I occupy that position out on a ledge, and how I maintained it, and how I now emerge at the age of 76 as a strong brand that people are aware of and sometimes acknowledge, but who basically want to keep separate from.
So in your memoir, you sum up your life and work when you wrote, I didn't formulate my theory of addiction for career advancement, although I would have welcomed that. I came to it out of conviction and dedication to the truth. For better or worse, my life revolves around finding and expressing meaning. And I would add to that, and having fun doing it. So, is that how you would kind of sum up what you've done?
I don't think I can do any better, Archie, than, well, you're reading what I wrote and you're adding the fun element into it. Thank you for doing that. And thank you for having been on this journey from start to finish, from going to the animal labs and talking about the love addicts that we knew, to helping me to write my memoir. And, we're not done yet. Thanks for your support and your able wife, Vicky's. Thanks also to my former wife, Mary Arnold, for allowing me to survive and to get this far, and hopefully to continue to have an impact on the field.
Yes, and thanks to Zach Rhodes for all he's doing now to carry on this work. And thanks to you, Stanton, for all of this constructive provocation and stimulation over half a century. And I recommend your book, A Scientific Life on the Edge, where you tell these stories with a good deal of wit and irony. There are fascinating stories in there that really reveal, some of the conundrums, but also the possibilities of life when you approach it as you've done.
Thanks again, Archie, and au revoir till we meet again.